Is the gig up, as the realist Tory Defence Minister Grant Shapps seemed to suggest this morning? Should Tory candidates just head to the pub, watch the Euros, contemplate life with Nigel Farage as their new leader? Let's speak to Tory candidate Philip Davis, also known as Mr. Esther McVeigh, fearless interviewer of Tory chancellors and presenter on GB News. So, Philip Davis, what do you make of this advice that Mr. Sunak should take the gloves off? I mean, does he have it in him to take the gloves off, and would it make any difference?
Well, look, Andrew, I think I don't think people like personal character attacks on other politicians. I don't think it's really particularly about that, but I think it is legitimate to point out the dangers of the other side winning. At the end of the day, election's about a choice, and I think it's perfectly legitimate to say this is the danger of electing a socialist government and sleepwalking into it. So I think we all need to do a bit more of that. But I'm not entirely sure it's in Rishi's nature to be to go on personal attacks. I don't really think that's him.
So I take what you're saying is stick to policies, don't make it personal. I understand that. What did you make of Grant Shapps, kind of almost metaphorically waving the white flag this morning, saying he's realistic, the Tories ain't going to win?
Well, look, you don't have to be Sir John Curtice to realise that we've got a mountain to climb, and that we're on the back foot, and we've got a huge task ahead of us. I mean, that's just self-evident. I'm not entirely sure that Grant Shapps was saying we should pack in and wave the white flag. I think he was merely pointing out that that's where the polls are at the moment, and that people ought to be aware of, if those polls are anywhere close to being right, what that potentially means for the country. I think that's a perfectly legitimate thing to point out, but that doesn't mean to say that right across our constituencies we're not fighting for every vote and trying to win as many votes as we can. But we've got to. We're looking at the poll. We look at the same polls as you do, Andrew, and I'm sure we almost come to the same conclusion.
Indeed, and even private polling the parties do is never really that different from the polls that are published. It's people talk about private polls as if they've got secret information, but they don't. But I mean, the harsh reality is that Labour have maintained roughly a 20-point lead throughout this campaign. Reform has somewhat surged since Nigel Farage became leader. There's now hope there'll be enough shy Tories around to make a difference. You and I know that there won't be. I mean, you're kind of left after all that with what? Praying for a miracle.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure it's quite a miracle, but it's pretty close to one, I guess. It's pretty close to one.
It would be miraculous if you won, I'd suggest.
I appreciate that. But look, I think the one thing I would say, Andrew, is that there isn't any great enthusiasm for the Labour Party out on the doorsteps. It's not as if you meet people who voted Conservative in 2019 who are rushing to vote for Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner to run the country. Often they fear that it will be worse, and so I think there are still people who are undecided. I think that there are still some voters out there, lots of people who are saying they're going to vote Reform, who are sort of treating this as a national by-election, so to speak, and it's where they can just say they think they can have a free hit at the government and say that they're frustrated about this, that, and the other. And of course, this isn't a by-election. This is a general election, and the result will matter, and what happens will have serious ramifications. And I think over the next 2.5 weeks, we've got to try and warn people of the dangers of socialism on steroids, which, if the polls are anywhere close to being right, is a real possibility. And that should frighten people who are thinking about voting Reform, and people who support Nigel Farage. That should frighten them too. And I think we've got a duty to point out that the calamity that people could be sleepwalking into.
What do you make of Nigel Farage saying this morning that he's got his eye on being Prime Minister come the next election after this one?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I wouldn't expect anything different from Nigel, to be perfectly honest. But I think,
well, he's never said it before.
No, he hasn't said it before, but just because he said it doesn't mean to say it's going to be true either.
No, but what do you think?
Well, they're on a crest of a wave at the moment, and I think when you're on a crest of a wave, sometimes you sort of overreach. It could be said, and I think that thinking that if we win, as they say, we might win 5 seats, a handful of seats, or whatever. I think it's a bit of a stretch to go from that to being Prime Minister. I don't know whether he's sort of thinking of defecting straight to the Conservatives after the election and standing for the leadership or something. I don't know what is in his mind.
Well, for it to work, there would have to be a post-election realignment of the right, in which he would see himself emerging as the new leader of a combined Tory stroke Reform party. Is that at all realistic? Could it happen?
Well, Andrew, this is, I think, if you don't mind me saying so, I consider this to be sort of post-match analysis, and we're sort of we've just started the second half, and so I'd rather keep the post-match analysis to after the referee blown the final whistle.
But you're kind of 6-1 down, which is why
Well,
we're
exactly.
we're already moving to the post-match analysis. I mean, I noticed that you don't immediately rule out the thought of Nigel Farage being your next leader.
Well, I mean, I think it's highly unlikely. But look, given what's happened in the last sort of 10 years of politics, it's a brave person who rules anything out anymore. To be fair, I thought I'd seen everything, but I think I've realised I haven't seen the half of it yet. So
No, I know what you mean. I mean,
I'd sooner spend the next 2.5 weeks trying to warn the public of the dangers of a Keir Starmer, Angela Rayner government, rather than sort of speculating on what may or may not happen after the event.
but maybe nobody's listening. I mean, you present a show on GB News. A recent poll showed that 60% of GB News viewers back reform, only 19% the Tories. I mean, isn't it time that you got in sync with your viewers?
Well, I don't present a show anymore on GB News, Andrew, not since
No.
Esther rejoined the cabinet. So that was so. I obviously wasn't doing a very good job, is probably what you're saying in a roundabout kind of way. I obviously must have to agree with that. I obviously wasn't doing a particularly good job of flying the Conservative flag on the channel, but yeah, look, I mean, I think most GB News viewers, they probably share exactly the same frustrations as I've had with the government over a number of years. I mean, I don't think any Conservative MPs voted against the Conservative Party more often in Parliament than I have. So I share many of those frustrations, but at the end of the day, the choice now is not whether we're frustrated or not. It's a choice between a Conservative government and a socialist government. And however many frustrations I might have had with the Conservative government over the years, that pales into insignificance with a Labour government. And I genuinely fear for what's coming down the line. You know, if you own any assets at all, shares, property, private pensions, anything like that, you know, you're going to get absolutely hammered by an incoming Labour government, and I don't think that has sufficiently registered with enough people yet.
Okay, Philip Davis, thanks for joining us. We'll leave it there.